Good morning, everyone, and sorry we had a slight tech difficulty there, but hopefully the sound is now coming through to you all. My name's Vicky Brown, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow with Deakin Health Economics and a member of the Centre for Research Excellence in Translating the Early Prevention of Obesity in Childhood, or EPOC Translate CRE. So today I'm calling in from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd really like to welcome everybody to the Emerging Leaders Symposium for 2023. Next slide, please. So the symposium is presented by the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre through the Collaboration for Enhanced Research Impact, or CERI. And for those of you who might not be aware, CERI brings together 11 different NHMRC Centres of Research Excellence, and you can see all of the logos on the slide there, all with a shared vision to find alignment in the policy and practice implications of all of the really excellent research that's being undertaken, and to develop shared advocacy for prevention. If you'd like to find out more about the work of the Prevention Centre and CERI, you can sign up for the Chronicle newsletter or join the Emerging Leaders Network, all on the Prevention Centre website. I'd just like to quickly thank the Prevention Centre's funding partners for their support for the symposium. Next slide, please. So as I said, welcome. This is the second year of this event, and we have a really great lineup split over 2 days this year. I'm starting obviously with the plenary now, and following the plenary today, we have a workshop on the value of prevention. Then please do join us tomorrow for our co-design and policy, law and regulation workshops. And of course, our virtual networking event, where you will have the chance to meet other researchers, policymakers and practitioners. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. You can access all of the sessions today and tomorrow by clicking on the agenda button on your screen. Don't forget to set up your profile so that other people can connect with you throughout the symposium. It only takes a couple of minutes, and it means that people will be able to find you and connect with you either using the attendee list or chatting through the Connect Hub, which are both to the left of your screen. And finally, please feel free to share your thoughts on Twitter or Threads with the hashtag Emerging Leaders. Before we start the plenary proceedings, I'd now like to warmly welcome Uncle Michael West, who is joining us for a welcome to country. Uncle Michael West is from the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council. He is from the Gomeroi Nation, born and raised in Sydney, and is a member of the Stolen Generations. Michael has had a variety of roles, including Director of the New South Wales Indigenous Chamber of Commerce, Co-Chair of the National CERI Day Committee and Cultural Advisor at TEDx Sydney. Thank you, Michael, and over to you.
Can you hear me now? Thank you. I was trying to get the unmute. I'm just down here, Bajadi Gamarua Gadagaliora, where we are down here. I'm just down near the harbour down here at the Domain. A beautiful day here in Sydney, looking at the water and people on the water going about, sailing and on boats. I can only wonder and think about what it would have been like those several hundred years ago with traditional Ngāwis canoes out on the water there on a beautiful day like this. Fishing, and then closer to the shore. In the canoes, the Ngāwis would more likely be women going around fishing. And if you come to Sydney and you go to the Opera House, please look up on the lawns behind the Opera House and you will see there's a big sculpture there these days. And that sculpture represents a Gadigal woman's fishing hook made from a shell. And it's a beautiful big sculpture. Everyone who comes into the harbour, the cruise boats and that, all see that. And it's just reinforcing that culture is everywhere. And here where we are in Sydney, obviously is where it's changed for everyone, for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have all impacted today, still from colonisation ongoing process. I'd like to acknowledge not only here, but also all the other lands that people are on, and asking people and urging people to make a connection and understanding of the country that you're on, and the rich history that is there, because there's many wonderful stories. I'm not sure if you guys know about the Brewarrina fish traps in New South Wales, but they are more than 40,000 years old, the fish traps. They are stones arranged in a way to manage the fish, and so it's easily to collect them and to manage them, collect the big ones and let the small ones through. And also we need to look after these sites and our culture, but not only for our fellow Australians, but humanity itself, because we go back more than 65,000 years, and it's important to learn from us and to learn from each other. And we can see when the impacts of that when it hasn't been done properly with caring for country. And we've seen that recently with the very, very sad incident with all the king penguins drowning, the babies, the chicks, all drowning down there because the ice didn't come back. And we've got droughts, fires, and we have floods. And we're exposing ourselves to regions on this planet that have not been exposed to humanity for more than hundreds and thousands and millions of years. So we really need to respect Mother Earth. Mother Earth provides us with everything. It's important we do take a moment's silence to pay respects to our ancestors, pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tradition owners, elders and custodians of the past and present. And also, we need to remember those we've lost going through this pandemic, because they weren't just numbers. They're people who had their own dreams, their own aspirations as we have, and they all part of families and communities. And we need to remember that. And also, we need to pay respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tradition owners, elders and custodians of past and present, looking after the country, the spirit of the country and the culture, and paying respects to, as I said, Mother Earth. She gives us everything, and we're not always respecting her. And reflect your journey right here, right now, because leadership is not like management. Leadership is very important. And being a good leader, it's not about you. It's about serving others, I think. So if we have a moment of silence, a moment of paying respects, and a moment of reflection of our journey, thank you. In Sydney, we have three beautiful waterways, the Hawkesbury, the Pan and Georges, which are the aquatic boundaries of Euro Nation. To any of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander brothers and sisters out there today, we warmly welcome from country, from clan, from tribe, from nation. And to all our brothers and sisters, we all remember we belong to one big mob, and that's humanity. We warmly welcome from your family, your neighbourhood, community, ultimately country you come from. We see this beautiful blue sphere floating through the ever-expanding cosmos. We should always treat each other with respect. We should always treat each other with dignity. Treat people the way you want to be treated is what I've been brought up to believe in and practice. I think it's so important. And look, we're having some tough conversations about voice treaty truth. Just always be respectful in our conversations or our yarns, as we say. And that I heard, look, I think it's important that you understand that we looked at the facts in making our decisions, and always make informed decisions of balance between our heart and our mind and our culture and identity, and do things in an informed way. Because the data and the research has been very important to us the last few years getting through this pandemic, through a very difficult time in the world. So from Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome everyone for the next couple of days. Enjoy your time, keep up the good work. As I said, look, we need to rely on data, we need to rely on the science, and we've seen around the world when you're not relying on the data and science, and it's been a bit hazy the last few years, and we even had people telling other people to inject themselves with bleach, which is not logical or good for one's health. So, okay, everyone, enjoy the day. I hope everyone takes that time out to connect with Mother Nature. Look at the birds. We're all connected. And when you get a chance, look at Huntingbird Manuscript Vatican. Huntingbird Manuscript Vatican. You'll see a very familiar face in there that was in the Vatican more than 800 years ago. And it's quite amazing. I'll leave that with you. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land never ceded. Let's have those conversations, yarn we need to have.
Thank you so much, Uncle Michael West, for that welcome. It's a beautiful day here in Melbourne, and so I will be taking some time later this afternoon to look at the birds for sure. So thank you so much. So this morning we have three fantastic plenary speakers talking on a wide range of issues that are really important and timely in public health at the moment. Each will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have two of our speakers, Thomas Mayo and Jan Shanthosh, join us for a Q&A session towards the end of the plenary. If you have questions that you would like to ask the speakers, please put them in the Q&A function, which you will see on your screen. The questions will be moderated and we will try to get through as many of them as possible, so please do add them in. It's time now to move to our first speaker, and I'd like to welcome Mr. Thomas Mayo. Mr. Thomas Mayo is a Kurrareg Aboriginal and Kalkalgal Irrabomlay Torres Strait Islander. Thomas is the National Indigenous Officer of the Maritime Union of Australia and a signatory of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. He is the chairperson of the Northern Territory Indigenous Labour Network and a director on the Australians for Indigenous Constitutional Recognition Board. Thomas is the author of 6 books published by Hardy Grant and has many articles and essays published across the major media providers. We're extremely fortunate to have Thomas here today to talk to us about the Yes campaign and what you need to know. Welcome, and over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you for that very warm introduction. Thank you, Michael, for the welcome to country. Very important points in that. But I pay my respects to the traditional owners here. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present. If we could just go to the next slide. What I'm going to do with this presentation is try to ensure that everybody is fully informed about how we come to this opportunity right now as Australians to recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and our culture and heritage, and to do it in a meaningful way, a substantive reform that provides us the opportunity, a guarantee to be able to influence the laws and policies that affect us, including health, of course, and everything that is connected to health, housing, education, employment, infrastructure in our communities. This is vital to all of those things. But this is the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Next one, please. I'm sure you're all familiar with it now, but less familiar, you are likely less familiar with these statements and petitions that precede it. This is not an exhaustive list, but it will illustrate the lessons that go into the Uluru Statement and the call for a voice. This one here is a petition to the King in the 1930s. William Cooper was one of the leaders of the time, a great leader with incredible courage. The Aboriginal community back in those days, led by William Cooper, took a letter, a resolution, calling out the treatment of Jewish people in Germany in the lead up to World War II. Took that letter to the German embassy. Just shows that people who were thought of as less than human in their own country still had the courage to show that solidarity with people so far away. It says a lot about our culture. Next one, please. This one here is the 1963 Yirrkala Bark petitions. The Yirrkala Bark petitions were the Yolngu people who were seeking to protect country. The petition is to the federal parliament. Federal Parliament was moving to excise a massive portion of Yolngu land to a mining company for a bauxite mine. They said in this petition that they fear that they will suffer the same fate as the Larrakia tribe. So they saw the Darwin settlement and city that was expanding there. They thought the Larrakia people had suffered terrible harm and may have been wiped out. So they feared that, and they made this petition to try and protect their hunting grounds and sacred sites, their families and communities, and took the matter to the Supreme Court Northern Territory, lost that case, and the mine went ahead. But the decision in that case was a precursor to the success of Mayo in the 90s. Next one, please. This here is a Larrakia petition to the Queen. The Larrakia people survived. They're doing great work in revitalising culture and languages back home where I live. I live in Darwin, always have. And you can see this petition patched together, petition thumbprints of illiterate people, Aboriginal people. So I bring these to your attention, not an exhaustive list, but I bring these to your attention because they are they have two things in common that are very important. Firstly, each of these petitions and statements called for political representation or a voice, and each of these statements and petitions were dismissed and ignored by the King or the Parliament or the Queen that they were written to. The next slide, please. This is the Barunga Statement. The Barunga Statement in 1988. Barunga is a small Aboriginal community near Katherine in the Northern Territory. You can see the late great Yunupingu shaking Bob Hawke's hand there. The Barunga Statement once again called for a voice. I separated out because Hawke bothered to listen. He promised two things that the Barunga Statement called for. He promised a voice. He also promised a national treaty, which the Larrakia petition to the Queen also called for. He failed to deliver on that, but he did deliver on the voice. Next slide, please. If you could just go forward the first four parts, stop there. So the Hawke delivered the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which brings us to this next pattern that informs this moment in time and the Uluru Statement. These voices were established without waiting for the King or the Parliament or the Queen or anyone else to establish it for us. And I just want to make this point. It's a natural thing for a large group of people to do, to organise structure so that they can choose representation, mechanisms to hold that representation to account, pooling their resources or finding the resources to bring people together, to have informed debate and discussion, to reach a consensus, to go out coherently and with some discipline to achieve change. Unions, councils, nations, business councils, industry associations, Indigenous people, no different to any other human group, understood that this was an important thing to do, so we did it without waiting. But you will see here that they all had quite a short time in existence. 1924, the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association established, disappeared from the public eye by around 1927. These voices were all silenced by pure intimidation and ignorance. The authorities could steal our children, direct us to work without pay, decide who we could marry, exile us from country, separate us from our families, and withhold any wages that we did, as meagre as they were in those days, if at all, and not just rations. And so they used those powers that they had, complete control over our lives, to intimidate the leaders of those representative bodies or voices and to see them silenced. The next one's the rest of the page, please. 1967 was a turning point, the referendum, the most successful our country has ever had. Over 90% of Australians voted yes to seeing us counted as citizens in the census, and also to change the power or to provide the federal parliament with the power over Indigenous affairs, which before that resided with the states that were particularly cruel and negligent, which is why Indigenous people fought for that particular change for decades. But it saw governments start to establish voices. Whitlam established the National Aboriginal Consultative Committee. Fraser came in, got rid of that one, established the National Aboriginal Conference. Hawke came in, got rid of that one, established the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was a result of our activism in the Barunga Statement. Howard got in. Howard had vehemently opposed the establishment of ATSIC in opposition. When he won power, ATSIC's days were numbered. He immediately went about destroying it. What Howard did was he amplified ATSIC's problems, but I ask you to reflect on this. All organisations have problems from time to time, But as you can see on that screen, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representative bodies have never had the chance to learn from our mistakes, where it's a democracy, never had the chance to choose better leadership over time, and to evolve with the needs of our people. They have all been silenced, so Howard amplified its problems, didn't celebrate its successes, and it was achieving great things, as an inquiry that Howard instigated found and recommended that ATSIC should continue with some reforms. Howard ignored that, and with the support of the Latham Labor opposition, managed to silence that voice as well. In the absence of ATSIC, pretty soon afterwards, we saw the Northern Territory intervention. We saw hundreds of millions of dollars, over $500 million, cut from frontline community services that you and your profession would be well aware of the repercussions of that. Babies, children that needed support for fetal alcohol syndrome, people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people suffering from the traumas carried from generation to generation, the illnesses that are unique in our communities. Those services were vital. And we saw earlier this year, Peter Dutton flying into Alice Springs saying that the youth crime was a reason not to have a voice, when the youth crime, the rates of youth crime, are a result of those services not being available to those families and to those babies when they needed them. Real repercussions. When we don't have a voice, like any other group of human beings, we're easily exploited, ignored, degraded, and divided. Next slide, please. So these are the lessons that went into the dialogues. We considered these lessons from a history of struggle, and I'll summarise. That we need a voice because we make greater progress when we have a voice. All of those national voices achieved great strides forward. But when we don't have a voice, we know we go backwards and the gap widens. 2023, you would all be aware of those measures and the failures. So we considered that. We also considered that if most of our statements and petitions have been ignored, the Uluru Statement is written to the Australian people. So these dialogues considered those things, decided our priorities. The top priority was a voice because we learnt those lessons, but a voice enshrined in the Constitution because we could not ignore that pattern of voices being silenced over and over again every time there is a change of government. Next slide, please. After many days of passionate debate and discussion, we reached a consensus, and that is the Uluru Statement. So at this point, I want to help you to clearly see that this referendum is not Albo's idea, it's not a Labor Party idea, it's not a Canberra voice. This has come through an informed decision based on the history of our struggle, the lessons from the past, and the hard work that we did to reach a consensus at Uluru, and that in itself was a political feat that should be celebrated. 250 of 270 endorsed it on the final morning at Uluru. Next one, please. Keep going till you reach the Constitution slide. So the Uluru Statement was almost immediately dismissed, but we didn't take no for an answer. 5 more years of extremely hard work to convince the Labor Party to support it, and they won government in May last year, which has set us on the course of changing the Constitution. Constitution, a lot of Australians are low on understanding of civics. Constitution is the size of a passport. It defines the powers of our government, the separation of powers, what institutions should be established, and the Parliament decides the rest in legislation. The agreement is between the colonies. It is an agreement between the colonies that became the states. It also included clauses that explicitly excluded Indigenous people. Next one, please. It includes the race power. It was changed in '67, as I said, to give the federal parliament power over Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to make special laws. That power since '67 has only been used to make laws about Indigenous people. We are still subject to that. I include this slide because the No campaign is saying that since '67 we're all equal and race was removed. That is a complete lie. Special laws are made about us, and as in the Hindmarsh case in the 90s, determined it could be used to make laws to our detriment, not necessarily to our benefit. Next one, please. How do we change the Constitution? We need a referendum, majority of voters overall, and a majority of voters in a majority of states. The territories only feature in the first part of that count, the overall numbers. Next one, please. What is the change? Next one, I prefer to use this slide. Here is the change. Next slide, please. It is a new Chapter 9 that will go into the Constitution should we pass this referendum. Section 129, 92 words follow, and I'll just paraphrase in the interest of time, but basically that first line sets up recognition of Indigenous people as the First Peoples. Then it gives a guarantee that there'll be a body to be called an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice, so that is the guarantee of a voice regardless of the political whims. 2, the voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Indigenous peoples. That sets up the function that we should have a ability to make representations, to give advice, not to force anything on Parliament or the Australian people, but to give advice. And 3, with absolute safety and certainty, this ensures that the Parliament decides all matters, including the model for the voice, but subject to 1 and 2, that there will be a voice and it can make representations. Next one, please. The argument about detail is rubbish. You've just seen the detail. We are enshrining the principle in our Constitution that there is an obligation to establish the voice, the model, the legislation, how many reps, the structure, how they're chosen or elected. It will be elected, set terms. All of those things are decided by the Parliament. We elect them to do that job and we hold them to account. If the Constitution had to have every bit of detail about how much tax and where the tax office should be and how elections are held and all the rest, we would not be a federation right now, because we would have endless debate and would also be stuck with things that could not flexibly evolve with the times. It is a ridiculous argument. Next one, please. But there is design principles. I'm not going to go through them in the interest of time. I might be running out of time. So there are many more of these. There are dot points under each of these points. Look up voice design principles and you'll find them. But we have negotiated these because we couldn't say exactly how many reps there will be and all that sort of stuff, because the Parliament decides that after the referendum, but these will be guiding principles to that model, such as independent advice, accountable and transparent, work alongside existing organisations such as NACCHO and those Aboriginal organisations that are very strong supporters of this campaign and this reform that we are seeking. It sets up that it'll be chosen by Indigenous people based on the wishes of communities, gender balanced, etc. It won't have a program delivery function as ATSIC did, because we have Aboriginal controlled organisations that do that work now, among others. It will have the function of the voice is to make representations to improve policies, programs, and laws. And it won't have a veto power. Next, please. Next. This is the campaign. I hope that I have not only empowered you through information so that you can have conversations, and I want you to do that. There is 39 days until this referendum. If this fails, we as a country will go backwards. A key measure to improve the pace that we close the gap will be lost, and governments or politicians that don't want any progress in recognition and improvement in the lives of Indigenous people, the same ones that are lying about what this is about, they will have wind in their sails. It will be a dark path for us to take. We're at a fork in the roads, and it is for us, without relying on the media or anyone else, to make this a success. So have conversations with everybody using hopefully some of the information or the way that I argued them to support your conversations with everybody that you possibly can between now and the referendum. I also want you to volunteer for the campaign, yes23.com.au. So volunteer. We need door knockers, we need phone bankers, we need leafletters. We need you to join this campaign and throw everything that you can at it over the next 39 days. Next one, please. A useful resource. There are plenty of great resources out there. Melbourne University, RMIT, they've got some great stuff. There's more and more stuff on social media to share and to use. Kerry O'Brien and I have written this book, The Voice to Parliament Handbook, all the detail you need. It is light, small, fits in your back pocket, cheap. You can get it for $12 at Big W. You can buy it online. All independent bookstores have it. I have heard so many anecdotes of people that aren't confident in making the argument, just giving a copy of this to someone. It only takes 2 hours to read, and handing them that and changing people from no to yes. So it's something that is useful. Also, it is the feature book on Audible I just heard. So it's free if you are signed up to that. You can listen to Kerry and I reading it to you. It might be very useful to you or anyone else that you can think of. That's my presentation. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for obviously that incredibly timely talk. Just a reminder that if you have any questions for Thomas, please put them into the Q&A function, and we'll have time towards the end of the plenary to address some of those questions. We'll now move on to our next speaker, and I just wanted to quickly note that we do have a bit of a change to the original program today, with the CMO, Paul Kelly, unfortunately unable to join us. But I am now very happy to welcome Professor Andrew Wilson, who is co-director of the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre and co-director of the Menzies Centre for Health Policy and Economics at the University of Sydney. Andrew's research and teaching interests include all aspects of health policy, but especially in the area of chronic disease. In addition to his academic career, he has been Deputy Director General, Policy Planning and Resourcing at Queensland Health, and Chief Health Officer and Deputy Director General, Public Health at New South Wales Health. Andrew also chairs the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee for the Australian Government Department of Health. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us here today to discuss some of the current issues in prevention. Before you get started, I will just note that Andrew isn't able to join us for the Q&A session towards the end of the plenary. So if you have any questions for Andrew specifically, please put them in the Q&A function. And if we have a few spare minutes at the end of his talk, we will fit a couple in before he has to leave for his next engagement. Welcome, Andrew, and over to you.
Thanks, Vicky. And I'd just like to thank Uncle Michael for his introduction, and Thomas, fantastic. I feel like I don't want to say anything further, just let us mull over the words, and they're so important to I see the recognition of the voice in the Constitution and moving forward in that regard. That said, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're gathered. For me today, the Ngunnawal people, and acknowledge the First Nation elders, past, present, and particularly for this meeting and conference audience, the future. Now, most of you are aware, as Vicky's just said, you've got me as second best. Professor Paul Kelly, the Chief Medical Officer, was unable to be with us today. Hardly surprising when you think of what Paul's got to do at the present time, in addition to being CMO, the establishment of the Australian CDC. It's a sign of his commitment to public health research and capacity building that he even tried to join us for this meeting, but you've got second best. So today I was asked to talk about future prevention in Australia, some of the challenges and opportunities. I will along the way sort of touch on some national agendas in prevention, and I'll touch on some thoughts on the CDC. But spoiler alert, I have no insider knowledge to share on this. What you're going to hear today are my views and maybe entirely nonsense in terms of the current planning and the implementation of the National Preventive Health Strategy and the establishment of the Australian CDC. Personally, I think there's value in bringing all of prevention into a highly visible institution, but I recognise this may not be possible or even desirable in the short term. And in a federation comes with risks when we try to establish national entities. And we'll see the complexity of that. Michael just sort of outlined some of it, even trying to reach a consensus as a nation on something which to me is as straightforward as the voice. However, regardless of what happens with the ACDC, I do know that we must continue the development of a better coordinated system with a truly systems approach to prevention, including the prevention of chronic disease. So today I'm going to indulge in a little self-reflection on my research career in prevention, and specifically the prevention of cardiovascular disease. In doing so, I want to share some of my learnings from those experiences that will hopefully help us think more generally about some of the priorities in research and development in chronic disease prevention. Now, all of us have seen the carefully staged release of the 2023 Intergenerational Report. Some may have read the executive summary, and a few of us even have awoken by the sound of our iPads falling to the floor, having nodded off trying to read the detail. Like its predecessor, the report has a bit to say about the growing costs of health and aged care, with the usual, what I think is disdainful reflections on the impact of aging. But then I guess I better acknowledge that I'm 66. I say disdainful because not once has any of these reports acknowledged the extraordinary nature of the rapid increase in life expectancy since the mid-1960s, a phenomena unique in human historical record, a growth of 20 plus years in less than half a century. Moreover, while it remains unclear to what extent it's a longer but unhealthy life, the proportion of older Australians continuing to participate in the workforce has increased. That is, the number that are continuing to contribute to the economy, to the tax base, and to the well-being of our nation. Now, for me, providing this is not at the expense of the participation of others, such as younger people or people with disability, or by necessity because of the cost of living, then I think this is a good thing. We can say with some certainty that this increase in life expectancy has been substantially contributed to by the prevention of chronic disease, especially cardiovascular disease, indeed by as much as 50%. Massive reductions in smoking, better control of high blood pressure and blood lipids have been part of that factors. The lessons for us is that we have to work to move the argument for prevention from that of a measure to reduce the future costs to one of growing the well-being, the long-term well-being of our nation. Now, this change in life expectancy has not been shared equally. While almost all parts of the Australian population have experienced improvements in life expectancy, some have benefited much less than others, most notably First Nations people. Overall, there's been a small narrowing of the socioeconomic status difference in cardiovascular disease mortality, but there's still a gap between the highest and lowest socioeconomic stratas. Behind that, if you look at just about every indicator about prevention, there are gaps. The residual smokers, those with poorly controlled blood pressure, those with low physical activity, those with poor mental health, or very commonly a combination of all of these. So our current and future focus has to be on how we reduce these gaps, how we achieve more equity in prevention. I want to make 2 points out of this. A substantial focus in the prevention of cardiovascular disease has been on the control of individual risk factors. A limitation of such focus is that individual-based behavioural interventions always have a risk of being inequitable. There will always be some people who are able to respond easily, who understand why and what is necessary, and are equipped socially, culturally, financially, and mentally to respond to that. But a large number of people will not be in that situation and will need support to get there. Those barriers are frequently tied, if not inherent, in the broader social determinants of health: poverty, discrimination, racism, homelessness, or at least increasing home insecurity. So we need to think about this when we are designing and implementing preventive interventions. At least some of the angst that has occurred in our community during the COVID response related to well-intentioned interventions to prevent the spread of COVID, but which were inherently inequitable. We need to recognise this and consider it when we're putting interventions in place and take appropriate action to try and reduce the impact if we can't find more equitable ways of doing things. The next topic I want to touch on is the importance of the primary consideration on the diversity of the Australian community in thinking about prevention. Back in the early 1990s, as a wet behind the ears babe in epidemiology, I worked with a health promotion team in what was then Central Sydney Area Health Service. We started the program looking at smoking behaviour among Greek Australians. Like many groups, migrant groups then and now, they had much higher smoking rates in the broader community. We decided to focus on adult males and to take an approach which was about caring for family based on work which we'd done, which showed this was a potential motivator. It was a fascinating journey for me as we developed and evaluated that intervention. It gave me incredible insights into working across cultural and language barriers. Now, since then, the Australian community has continued to diversify both culturally and ethnically. Indeed, the proportion and diversity of Australians that come from non-Anglo-Celtic backgrounds has increased very substantially. We need to consider this when we start to plan strategies in prevention from the start. We can no longer see it as something we consider after choosing interventions, but it must be intrinsic and implicit part of our initial research and choices if we are to address the prevention needs of our multicultural Australia. Some 3 decades ago, when both my age and my body mass index was on the better side of 30, I became interested in the growing epidemic of obesity and diabetes. I was particularly interested that this was occurring in the context of an ongoing fall in cardiovascular disease mortality. Now, as you are well aware, diabetes and obesity are strong risk factors for cardiovascular disease. An analysis of cardiovascular mortality I undertook at the time suggested there may have been some flattening of the rate of fall in cardiovascular disease among young males, but it really did not seem to have much effect. Now, here we are 30 years later. The obesity and diabetes prevalence in our community has more than doubled, but we have still not seen a general increase in cardiovascular disease mortality. It's likely, but hard to demonstrate, that this is due to the benefits of better control of smoking, high blood pressure, and possibly lipids, as well as better treatment particularly for cardiovascular disease and diabetes, which have dampened the impact of this increase in obesity and diabetes. Of course, it hasn't stopped the many other complications of diabetes and obesity. Now, there are new treatments coming available for diabetes and obesity, which are more effective, including new medications for reducing weight. They work, but they're expensive and will come at considerable cost. I've seen one estimate that 60% of the US population, the adult US population, would be potentially eligible under the current FDA-approved restrictions for the new weight loss medications. And Australia is unlikely to be vastly different, given our pattern of obesity is rapidly approaching that of the USA. The market value of one of those companies for their weight loss drug alone was reported to be the annual GDP of their home country, Denmark. Of course, we want access to those medications for appropriate patients. But do we want to burden future generations with this, with the increase and with the ongoing increase in cost of treatment and obesity and diabetes? Of course not. So we need prevention as well as treatments in managing obesity and diabetes. So somehow we have to balance our investment in prevention and treatment to achieve the best population health outcomes for the community. We also need to do it in a way that the benefits are equitable, as the prevalence of obesity is not evenly distributed in our population. We need proper, effective population health level environmental strategies that improve nutrition, disincentivize diet components known to increase the risk of obesity, and increase the attractiveness of activity in all forms. The Prevention Centre has sponsored a range of work looking at investment in prevention. And more recently, the Public Health Association of Australia has taken up the need to have a better mechanism of choosing best buys in prevention. A new PBAC, the Prevention Boosting Advisory Committee. Now, As we have discovered more, it has become harder to link all the information together. I've grown in my research career from using punch cards to enter data into a room-sized mainframe to an iPad that has the same computing power and can take data directly from subjects, including measure of biological parameters. It is including painstaking coding to test for simple statistical interactions through multivariate models to hierarchical models. All were fantastic and still are. Well, not the punch cards. But for me, my more recent journey of discovery into complex systems thinking has been a game changer in the way I think. The Prevention Centre got me seriously involved in understanding the concepts of system thinking and in understanding the power of tools like system dynamic modelling for integrating information of both a quantitative and qualitative type. In prevention, where everything we deal with involves complex systems, it will be a core part of the expertise set of future public health practitioners. My last observations about some of the negative forces prevention has faced, and I suspect we will all have to deal with. Most successful prevention interventions involve some sort of level of environment change, whether it's banning smoking indoor smoking or taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. These interventions are portrayed as reducing individual freedom, a convenient phrase amplified by commercial interests who suffer negative consequences of such interventions. But where there are commercial interests, there are political interests. This is not you. Ask any of the campaigners for tobacco and alcohol controls. But during the COVID pandemic, we have seen this amplified in an even greater way by the combined forces of anti-scientists and those who have lost trust in good government. The vehicle of social media has allowed non-science, the misinformation that has always been part of this operation, to be transmitted in an uncontrolled way directly to vulnerable individuals. Advocates for prevention are delivered in a more personal way. How this is countered must be part of our research and development agenda going forwards. Now, last but not least, the Australian Centre for Disease Control. We all want our CDC to incorporate the breadth of prevention, but comparable CDCs in other countries did not come at what they are overnight. The US CDC grew by a process of acquisition of entities over some 25 years, changing from the Communicable Diseases Centre to the Centre for Disease Control in 1971 and to the 70s and to the Centres for Disease Control in 1981. So it will take us time to find the right model for our CDC in chronic disease prevention. And in the meantime, we can't wait. Moreover, while there are many challenges in the Federation, one thing it does allow us is some level of innovation. People can try different things in different settings. I recommend, for example, that you read the most recent Vic Health Strategy, not the least because of its wholehearted adoption of systems-based thinking and a system-based approach. So thank you for giving me time today to share my random thoughts with you. I apologise that I have to leave early to go to a meeting at Parliament House for another presentation, this time in my role for the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee. But I'm happy to take any questions or by email in that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So many, critical random thoughts, as you put it. As a health economist, your comments on the Prevention Boosting Advisory Committee got me very really something that I think is so critical and so needed in terms of trying to really get that balance, that really precarious balance that exists between prevention and treatment, using things like systems approaches and ensuring that equity considerations are built in right from the get-go. So thank you so much for your presentation. If you don't mind, we do have a couple of questions if you've got time. The first is, what profile do you think prevention has in the current political environment, and what can we do to persuade politicians to invest in prevention?
So prevention is always something that runs off the mouth of every health minister that I've ever met. has always publicly mouthed the words and the importance of prevention. The issue has always been about translating that into action and to investment and getting them to do things. And I think to do this, we not only have to make our case very strong in terms of what those benefits are, we have to. My approach to this is that regardless of the political colour of the health minister and of the government of the day, there are always things that you can sell them in the prevention space. But you have to understand the limits and the parameters in which that can happen. So you don't always get what you want. You don't always get it, but there are always things that you can sell. And I think we have to think about that and think very carefully about where those opportunities arise in relation to particularly in ministers and governments.
Absolutely. And if you've got time for one last question, we've got people that are joining us today from across the research, policy and practice worlds. What is your top tip from your own experience in trying to work collaboratively across research, policy and practice?
Look, it's like anything else. The first and most important step is to actually understand the other person's position. It's what we heard from Thomas before about understanding what the other, what the implication are. What are they trying to work with, and trying to see things from their side, and then understanding how that impacts on you. Now, sometimes when you look at it that way, you'll walk away. You'll say, "Well, I can see where this is, and nothing's going to happen in this sense." But sometimes, what it does, it makes you aware that what those opportunities are, the sensitivities that they have to deal with, but trying to see it, from the other person's perspective. I'm also a big one for sharing the experience. I've obviously spent a significant part of my time in government as well as in research. And if there are opportunities to go and see how the other side works, I urge people to do it. Even if you go in and hate it for a while, go and do it, and then hate it. You'll at least understand it.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you so much for your presentation, touching on so many critical points. We will let you go and move on to your next engagement at Parliament House. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. We will now move on to our final speaker, and I'd like to welcome Dr. Jan Shanthosh. Jan is a public health law researcher with a background in children's law and human rights. She is most passionate about using the law to shape healthy, more equitable environments, especially for vulnerable populations. Jan completed her PhD at the University of Sydney, supported by the Prevention Centre and the George Institute for Global Health. In June 2012, she represented Australia at the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child Review of Australia. For our final presentation, Jan will be talking about the potential of human rights for achieving equity in prevention. And again, just a quick reminder that if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function. Welcome, Jan, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's such an honour to be able to follow Thomas and Andrew. Very hard acts to follow. And Andrew was actually one of my PhD supervisors years ago. So it was wonderful to be on the same panel today. Today, I am speaking to you from Darug and Gundagara lands in the Blue Mountains. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which I speak. And today I've kindly been asked to speak on the transformative potential of human rights for achieving equity and prevention. And this topic means a great deal to me. Having had training in law and human rights and public health, I've been a keen observer of both spheres and have in the recent past had the job of bringing researchers from both camps together in developing a health and human rights program for the George Institute and the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW. So the connective tissue between both of these fields is really driving change by ensuring the conditions in which people can live healthy lives. But the approaches that we use, the underlying worldview is quite different. Human rights often focuses on norms and standards, and public health, at least in part, focuses on implementation and measurement. And in this sense, human rights and health is, from my perspective, not only a powerful message, but a very necessary one. So human rights are inherent to all of us, regardless of nationality, sex, national or ethnic origin, colour, religion, language, or any other status. And they are the fundamental principles and values that recognise and protect the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, and establish the basic conditions that are necessary for a life of freedom, equality and justice. In Australia, human rights are protected both at the domestic and international levels, with some serious gaps. At the domestic level, some states, for example, some states and territories have their own Human Rights Act, and we also have federal laws to protect people from breaches from their human rights. We do not have a national act or a charter of rights, and the Australian Human Rights Commission has strongly advocated for this and put forward a proposed model as part of their Free and Equal project, citing that human rights actually aren't very well understood in Australia or protected. And at the international level, we are also a signatory to various international human rights treaties. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Convention of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So really broad conventions, and then those that focus in on specific populations. So when we talk about the transformative potential of human rights in achieving equity and prevention, there's a number of factors that I wanted to talk about. First and foremost, there is this concept of rights holders and duty bearers, and this really sets it apart from perhaps other equity frameworks. So rights holders are individuals and groups of people who have specific rights recognised in human rights law and principles. And these include civil rights, the right to privacy, political, the right to freedom of assembly, to participate in government, economic, the right to work, social, the right to housing, which has been mentioned a couple of times this morning, and cultural rights, the right to participate fully in cultural life. And duty bearers, of course, are governments and institutions responsible for making sure that these rights are respected, protected, and fulfilled. And so again, this is the major difference between other frameworks and the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which are voluntary in nature. And while they have been absolutely crucial in setting important targets and principles for global development and equity, they do lack the legally binding nature and the clear rights holders and duty bearers relationship there. So we can look at this in the context of the right to health and unhealthy diets. Again, overweight and obesity has been spoken a lot about this morning by Andrew. So the right to health framework, for example, imposes 3 levels of obligations on governments to respect, protect and fulfill. So when it comes to the obligation to protect, this actually requires governments to prevent third parties from interfering with people's right to health. And violations can also come from omissions, such as the failure to regulate the activities of corporations and the failure to protect consumers. And in practice, this means ensuring food and beverage industries convey accurate, easily understandable and transparent information on their products. It means regulating to restrict the marketing of food products with excessive amounts of critical nutrients. It also means making sure that regulations are implemented and monitored through indicators and benchmarks. And we've seen very different models through voluntary models in Australia, industry self-regulation. The obligation to respect the right to health means that governments shouldn't engage in any conduct that's likely to result in preventable morbidity and mortality. And this includes incentivising the consumption of unhealthy foods and beverages. The obligation to fulfil also compels governments to adopt appropriate measures to towards the full realisation of the right to health. And that means requiring that governments disseminate appropriate information relating to healthy life and nutrition patterns, encouraging and supporting people in making informed decisions about their health, considering the extensive evidence of diet-related chronic diseases and NCDs. Governments should really also be formulating comprehensive policies that improve the availability and accessibility of healthy foods. So the human rights framework also offers guidance on how to embed equity at every stage of designing, implementing and evaluating a program, policy or law. That's really building off Andrew's words around the need for equity, a consistent approach, and not treating equity as an afterthought, and really sort of front-loading it into interventions. And so some of the ways that a human rights-based approach proposes that we do this in practice is by individuals and communities as rights holders actively participating in decision-making processes that affect their lives. Policies shouldn't just account for discrimination, but actively work to eliminate discrimination and acknowledge systemic inequalities. We should be collecting disaggregated data to identify and address disparities that are so often invisibilized in the data that we collect and work with and make assumptions from. It's also about allocating resources in a manner that guarantees equitable access to education, healthcare and housing, all of these interconnected factors for people in situations of vulnerability. And there also needs to be this accountability element to it built into prevention initiatives. And this means that duty bearers, governments and institutions are accountable for their actions and omissions concerning human rights. So here really human rights offers us an opportunity to craft effective, inclusive and equitable prevention policies and interventions that really benefit all of society. I do want to be very pragmatic here in saying that throughout my 10-year career, relatively short compared to others in public health, human rights has been useful to me in explicit ways, in crafting communication messages, in driving sort of powerful arguments for chronic disease prevention, and in less explicit ways. It's not always easy to work with lawmakers and policymakers using this language. So despite the legal component to human rights, which is very, very important, I take a very broad view on why this framework is useful for designing interventions. So on that note, for me, a human rights-based approach also means that interventions actually face up to complexity. So at times as a public health researcher, we focus solely on easily measurable health outcomes. And we can inadvertently this can inadvertently lead us to a quite narrow perspective of public health. And at times I would guess that very well thought through, well-intentioned interventions haven't worked because we have overlooked this intricate web of circumstances and underlying root causes that contribute to ill health. So the human rights framework, by integrating civil, political, social, cultural and economic rights, actually provides us, I think, with an opportunity to see interventions in their true context, unbound sort of by the constraints of very neatly categorized academic studies. So if we consider understanding the right to privacy can inform how health data is collected, stored and shared for specific communities. Recognising cultural rights can help tailor health programs to the cultural norms and practices of specific communities, culturally relevant diets, for example, ensuring that they are sensitive, respectful and much more likely to be acceptable. Economic rights, like the right to work, can inform intervention designers about the potential barriers related to unemployment, poverty, that may impact health outcomes. And social rights, like the right to housing, helps us consider the role of stable and secure housing. And these aren't this isn't rocket science, but particularly in my work and the work that I've been a part of, it is surprising how little opportunity sometimes we have to front load these considerations into the design of interventions. And we see that in the results, in the way that they are received by communities, and the way that interventions that have succeeded in a trial setting haven't translated into the real world. So I guess specifically for Indigenous peoples globally also, human rights-based approaches require governments to recognise the interconnectedness of Indigenous rights in all aspects of governance, encompassing land rights, cultural preservation and self-determination. And part of facing up to complexity means recognising that although we often describe policies, programs and laws as standalone interventions, they actually very rarely are. They interact with complex environments, including other laws, policies and programs. So that complexity needs to be reflected in the design of interventions, but also in its implementation, in the monitoring, enforcement and their reform. The fourth point that I wanted to make was really around the fact that by engaging with human rights as prevention researchers and policymakers, it actually does give us routine access to a global exchange of ideas and insights. So at the international level, Australia, along with almost 200 other UN member states, are reviewed every 4 to 5 years, depending on the convention, on its human rights record, with regard to children, with regard to discrimination against women, and so on. And during that process, governments submit reports, as do thousands of civil society organisations and researchers, reporting on the progress that governments have made, and many of the shortcomings of government interventions and strategies. And this means that interventions, hundreds of interventions, are being reported on all the time. And this is particularly relevant to prevention because globally we share so many of the same risk factors, from unhealthy diets to physical inactivity, tobacco use, to harmful alcohol consumption. And we also face many of the same challenges. So developing robust, acceptable health promoting legislation, addressing the needs of populations facing intersectional discrimination, communicating policy ideas to diverse populations to garner their support, reaching rural populations, data and evaluation gaps, sustaining momentum, scaling up, reforming interventions when they are no longer fit for purpose. These are all considerations that a number of countries in this global community are facing when it comes to prevention. So engaging with human rights also means engaging with this global exchange of ideas, of successes and failures around intervention design, implementation strategies, governance, financing models, and reform practices. So there's also an opportunity to think here about, think broader than our borders in Australia and work towards collective global action when it comes to prevention. And this is essential for many reasons, including the globalisation of the food system and production, distribution and marketing of food crossing national borders, which has created, as we very well know, near universal access to unhealthy products through branding, widespread availability, low cost and advertising. It's also essential because of the way that trade agreements and marketing practices of multinational corporations affect our health. And the fact that the chronic disease burden have significant economic and social consequences that extend beyond individual countries. So there's immense opportunity here in using the data produced through this system to gain insights into what works for prevention, to investigate new questions, to fill knowledge gaps and challenge existing theories. And a lot of my work has been in that area. At the same time, public health researchers are really uniquely positioned to generate systemic, replicable and potentially generalisable evidence that can feed back into human rights processes and be disseminated across the world, accelerating progress, or at the very least, our understanding of what works in prevention. And we have certainly seen that with plain packaging of tobacco in Australia, which has gone on to have a ripple effect, a hard-won ripple effect across the world. And because these engagements happen routinely in the human rights space through these reviews, they happen routinely, but they're also publicly documented. And we have, therefore, this historical view as well. And I wanted to use the example of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I would implore you to read some of Professor Megan Davis's work at UNSW. She's been a critical part of its implementation. And she wrote a groundbreaking piece that was hugely influential for me on the 20-year passage of this declaration through the UN. It was created basically because there was an absence of the international human rights law pertaining to the rights of Indigenous peoples to fill a very clear gap. It's a non-binding aspirational document of the developing standards relating to Indigenous peoples, and therefore provides an essential framework for human rights-based dialogue between Indigenous peoples and governments. And when it was adopted by the UN General Assembly, 143 UN members were in favour. Australia was one of 4 that was against. And after being initially in favour of the use of the term self-determination, there was a backflip due to concerns that it would imply Australia was prepared to have a separate Indigenous state, and politicians at the time favoured the term self-management. So years later, 2 years later, this was in 2009, Australia and all of the countries that had said no reversed their position, and we now fully support the declaration. There are echoes here of the ongoing debate regarding the voice, and engaging with human rights means having access to the strategies taken, the contextual drivers and barriers to change that we can learn from in the present. So I will end by saying that this topic means a lot to me because I have, in my limited experience, seen firsthand what it looks like to have a health and human rights project idea go from pen to napkin sketch on a train ride home to being endorsed by the United Nations Women's Rights Committee. So while these concepts can feel very far away, there are very practical reasons why we should engage with it. And huge benefits for achieving equity and prevention in terms of driving innovative evidence-based prevention strategies. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion ahead.
Thank you so much, Jan. So much of that really resonated with me, particularly early on where you said something along the lines of the connective tissue between research, policy and practices really around driving change, which I think probably resonates with everybody that's dialed in today. So thank you so much. And a big thanks to all of our speakers on those really interesting and super timely presentations. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the plenary. So if you have questions for the speakers, please continue to post them into the Q&A function, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. I might first of all start with a question for both speakers. Maybe you can answer first, Jan, and then Thomas following. And it's the same question that I had asked Andrew around what, from your experience, is your top tip in terms of trying to work collaboratively across the policy, practice and research worlds?
Yeah, look, I've not been for me, I realised some time ago that for all of the efforts we were making, you know, myself organising rallies and protests and petitions about the really harmful decisions that were being made, but also listening to organisations that, you know, like peak bodies and the efforts that they were making, that nothing was working, you know, far too little progress. It's not that we don't have any progress, but often we take 1 step forward and 2 steps back. You know, if you go back only, you know, 10 years, you can just see this, you know, decade by decade, this pattern. And so there really needs to be an overarching, unapologetic representative body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Because you know, I don't know if I mentioned this in my talk, but you know, there's great work being done in health and you know, and prevention, and on justice, you know, but it tends to be in silos. And an overarching representative body that can be purely about the politics of improving policies and laws and regulations and those types of things is going to be really important. And it's a big missing piece here.
Absolutely agree. Did you want to comment, Jan?
Sure. Just quickly, I think that particularly from a human rights perspective, the starting point certainly hasn't been with human rights in my work. So I think that working across the board with communities, with policymakers, subnationally and then internationally, it has been about the core principles. I think there's a lot of agreement. We somehow get hung up on the language of human rights and equity, but at the core of it, I think that there's a coalition of the willing to embed equity. It's just about finding pathways that are politically acceptable, that are communicated very easily to the public and across civil society organisations. And one of the tools that we've used is co-production. And so the Prevention Centre has a guide coming out in a couple of weeks that we've developed together that enables governments and researchers to work very closely together on these issues. Because for so long, particularly when it comes to laws, they have been developed in isolation from the people that are most affected by them. And you can't possibly foresee or anticipate the needs of a population behind closed doors. So I think we have made some progress to being able to have open conversations about what it takes to co-produce public health law together. And that is a pathway, an acceptable pathway we've found to embedding equity from the front end, whether that's sort of less explicitly using a human rights framework to embed these considerations, or embracing the human rights language and our obligations as a nation. So I think it's definitely not a one size fits all.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that really draws back to those sorts of tenets of the voice around that critical need for listening and recognition and consultation, and that's all really drawn into that. Thomas, we do have a question that's come in asking whether you can articulate how a yes vote has the potential to improve health outcomes for Indigenous people.
Yeah, one of the ways I'll do that is by just pointing out that, you know, housing affects health, education affects health, you know, infrastructure in communities, clean water, roads that, you know, don't see a busted tyre every 3 months to take your kids to school or to go and get medicine. You know, it's all connected. Consistently, you know, or reliable power, reliable internet in communities. You know, all of these things are connected to health and vice versa. So I've always taken that holistic approach, you know, on improving policies and laws, being able to connect the dots and see that overarching approach to policy is going to make a massive difference. But finally, I think I'll add, and it sort of goes to the previous question as well, is the ability to campaign. You know, it's not just a matter of having, you know, a systemic sort of or legal right to have a voice or even a human rights framework, but constitutional enshrinement of a voice, you know, a representative body, provides the ability, regardless of who's in government, and often, you know, and of course, governments come along that don't want to listen at all and can completely ignore. I mean, we saw the Racial Discrimination Act, Northern Territory suspended for the Northern Territory intervention. Yeah, that's right. You know, so a permanent representative body that's established by a referendum, you know, by the Australian people is just going to be so important.
Absolutely. We do have another question, Thomas, for you, wondering how can we influence migrant communities to support the referendum in a way that perhaps relates to their own experiences within their own countries to convince them for a yes vote, given the level of misinformation that may perhaps be influencing migrant communities, or especially those that may not be big viewers of Australian mainstream media, know English, or rely on things like social media for their information sources?
Yeah, well, firstly, and it is reflected in the discussions, that there should be, you'd expect a natural solidarity with Indigenous people from a lot of, ethnic groups, recent migrants. So there's that factor. But one of the arguments that I've heard, and one of, the tactics of confusion from the No campaign to migrant groups is to say, we came to this country and we've worked hard and we've built we've taken responsibility. And why don't Indigenous people just take responsibility and work harder like we did? And so Shireen Morris, Professor or Dr. Shireen Morris, she's really great at explaining this, but Indigenous people have been discriminated against for longer. When recent immigrants were able to buy houses and start to build generational wealth, Indigenous people still didn't have those rights or abilities. So there is a difference that needs to be pointed out. But the most important thing to do is to communicate in their language, right? So there is, I think that it's migrants for yes.com.au or something like that. There's over 50 languages, information interpreted. So please find and use those resources to help people to have the clearest and best explanations. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. Really useful resources there. I do have a question for you, Jan, that's come in on the chat. In terms of how you reconcile the tension between complexity in systems, including chronic disease and prevention systems, and the essentialism of human rights-based models, including health rights models.
That's such a good question. I think that this is where I found it really useful to work between both fields, because I think sometimes, with all due respect to my law colleagues, theoretical arguments don't necessarily always translate in the implementation of programs. So I think there are ways to use the human rights framework, for example, to develop interventions that still follow our traditional sort of public health route, evaluating single outcomes in order to produce evidence that it's acceptable by our community and by policymakers, but by designing a very sophisticated implementation strategy that takes into account far broader issues, or in the communication, the evaluation, the monitoring, the enforcement of these interventions. So I think this is where I think that I mentioned it as a sort of powerful marriage between the two. I think, my frustrations from working within law have sometimes been that there's a blind spot when it comes to implementation issues. There's a very in-depth issue of theoretical human rights issues that are not necessarily front of mind or matter all that much to communities on the ground. So I think I have always loved working in multidisciplinary teams for this reason, because you work together, figure out what the most important issues are, problem clarity, which is sometimes 80% of the job, and the best way to move forward. So I don't actually believe hugely in human rights experts, or calling oneself an expert, because you're never the expert when it comes to each project. You're coming in with a clean slate, thinking that you know some things that might be helpful in that situation. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But the most important thing is listening to communities and working side by side to develop solutions that that are tailored to those communities, as opposed to relying on the assumptions of the literature, or the assumptions of very high level data that doesn't take into account the unique needs of specific populations. I hope that didn't sound like I was sidestepping the question, but I guess
not at all, not at all. And Thomas, would you like to add any comments to what Janice just said?
No.
No? Okay. We'll move on to the next question. And this one's for you, Thomas. Do you have any lessons to share on the challenges in bringing together so many groups from across the country to unite on the Uluru Statement and call for a voice? We in public health can often be siloed, and I think we've already heard about that today, and really need to better unify despite common goals. So yeah, whether you have any lessons to share in terms of the challenges from your experience would be really beneficial to hear about.
Yeah, look, just to the one about the languages and all that. I couldn't remember exactly the website, but go to, if you email hello, HELLO, at yes23.com.au and ask for what resources you need to help out this campaign, including that stuff, you should get a pretty quick response. So I've got that up and running. But in regard to working across, it's very difficult. You know, it's a massive country, and there's lots of different groups. It's very difficult to inspire our own people post Uluru Statement, because firstly, it was almost immediately dismissed. And then the second factor there is that we've had so many of our aspirational moments dismissed and ignored. Went through those other statements and petitions, but that's just a drop in the ocean. You know, the promises made and promises broken, the you know, endless consultations with no results or outcomes that are completely different to what Indigenous communities have proposed. You know, all of that makes it extremely difficult to inspire a group to work together on something, and especially when we have been so purposely divided for so long, right? There is purposeful, there are tactics of division that have been played against not just our broader populace of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but community by community. And so that has made it really difficult. But what we've had to do is just continue to work hard, relentlessly, knowing that what we are doing is the right thing, an important step forward, believing in that collective decision, that unique opportunity that we had to reach a consensus, to legitimise this, you know, as much as you can, without a structure like a voice already in place. You know, that is what we've had to do. In the area of health, you know, I don't know a whole lot about exactly how you guys work and all that, but my thoughts go to the peak bodies that you have, and always working to improve how they represent, you know, your area of expertise and what you do. But then for broader outcomes, you've got to think bigger. You know, you've got to think of ways to work outside of the silos and to collaborate and to get better policies, you know, because housing affects health, as I mentioned, and a whole lot of other things. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this campaign for a voice, is because I know that I could work on advocacy for housing forever and a day, you know, but there are all sorts of other factors. The root cause of all of the issues that I might campaign for is a voicelessness, you know, to the federal parliament, you know, where, you know, much of the decisions have repercussions or could have great positive effect when we get good decisions.
Absolutely. And Jan, did you have any reflections that you'd like to add?
None that would be useful. I found the presentation from Thomas this morning incredibly useful, and I'd already read the book. So I don't have anything to add on that. That was
sure.
Really useful.
We don't have too much longer for questions, but I might just ask a question to each of you now. And this one is about how we can address potential resistance and skepticism towards public health prevention measures in society. I think Andrew sort of touched on some of those issues around potential resistance or scepticism of some of the measures taken to try and improve population health. And I just wonder from your experience whether you can comment on how we might best address some of these issues. Do you want to go? Yeah. Jan, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think I will touch on what Andrew said earlier, which is sort of understanding each other's point of view. I have regularly come up against this throughout my work and throughout my research. I think it's definitely about framing prevention issues that are palatable for the moment and palatable for the context. And so I think, again, to touch on Andrew's comments, there are things that we can sell in prevention. And so it takes working outside of the silos, as Thomas was saying. It's very easy to come up with ideas in academia, very hard to implement. So I think gone are the days where we can just generate evidence and not be tasked with influencing the institutions that we are aiming our research at. And that really takes engaging with policymakers from the outset, as opposed to it being an afterthought. And with that comes an understanding of where their concerns are, where the policy windows are, the timing of interventions. And I am a huge advocate for co-production as well, as a way of combating some of that scepticism. Firstly, creating an environment where multiple disciplines are comfortable, policymakers working along researchers, and I've seen through our work that the magic that can result from that. So it's not always an antidote, but I think that there are positive ways to sort of address this through working together.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Dr. Jan said, but I would just add, because public campaigning. You know, you got to have a campaign that educates the public about the and aiming at the different things that might motivate people. You're probably already doing this. That's why I feel a bit funny saying it. But you know, people have different motivators. So the economic argument, you know, and the compassionate argument as well. The empathy about public campaign, educate people on the importance. That will help you move the ultimate decision makers. Yeah.
Amazing. I completely agree with everything that you've both just said. We're almost out of time today, so I wonder if you would like just a minute or so for any final thoughts. Thomas, perhaps if you have anything left unsaid that you'd like said, now would be the time.
Just to reiterate, join this campaign, 39 days, volunteer in your area, donate, do everything that you can. You know, this is your preventative health. You know, this is it. This is a key moment, a fork in the road, as I said.
Amazing. And Jan, thank you so much as well. And if there's anything that you would like to have a final comment on, or a question has come in about resources on those human rights-based approach frameworks, and where some nice sources of those might be. So I don't know if you'd like to comment on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some great work. Again, Professor Megan Davis has been hugely influential in this space. The UN is quite good. The Human Rights Commission, for example, we've got national institutions in Australia that very clearly articulate our responsibilities when it comes to human rights. I'm very happy to be emailed as well if you've got any questions on. There are very direct ways that researchers can actually feed your evidence, your very important evidence, into these UN processes with regard to specific populations, and it's an opportunity to have global impact. So very happy to answer questions on that as well. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today. That's all that we have time for in our plenary session today. I do want to just quickly reflect on so many important issues that we have heard about today. And so many of them are so interconnected and really demonstrate the opportunities, I think, for all of us on this call moving forward to help to address some of these key preventive health issues moving forward. I hope that you all go away having learnt something, or perhaps with a new perspective on something that we have heard about today. I did want to note that recordings of the plenary and all of the workshops will be available after the symposium. Thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for making the time to talk with us today and really sharing all of your reflections on all of the opportunities and the way that we should all be thinking about aligning our work more closely to really try to have that positive impact. I'd also really like to thank the symposium committee, who have worked really tirelessly to put together what I hope you will find is a really great and insightful event. And I'd like to especially mention both Karen Metcalf and Helen Signey from the Prevention Centre, who have really done so much of the hard work in terms of making sure this symposium has come together. So thank you, Karen and Helen. Please join us for the next session in the symposium, which is a webinar on the value of prevention. And this starts at midday today. So you've got time for a quick cup of tea and a bite to eat. And then we hope to see you back at midday. Please also do join us tomorrow, where we have some really great sessions planned. So the workshop on co-design begins at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We have a virtual networking event where you'll be able to join networking tables hosted by some real leaders in prevention. And then we have our final workshop tomorrow on working with policy, law and regulation. The full agenda and the links to join the various sessions are available in the menu bar on the left-hand side of your screen. And I will just ask quickly, if you are not joining us for any other sessions during the symposium, whether you can please click on the feedback link, which you should see on the left-hand side of your screen, and fill out a super short survey on how you found the plenary today. If you are joining us later today or tomorrow, you will have a chance to complete this survey then. That's all from the plenary session now. I just want to double down on that thank you to all of our presenters. Such so many important topics discussed today, and really for me invigorates me in terms of hearing about all of the work and the important aspects moving forward. So thank you all, and thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have enjoyed the session as much as I have. Thank you all.